going to become interested, hopefully, in beetles if you're not already. And thank you very much, Maya, for inviting me, because I think Maya has done more than most people for bringing beetles and the understanding and love of beetles to a larger audience. Now, you might ask me, why beetles? Well, whether you're standing in a platform in the Amazonian rainforest, or whether you're on a mountainside in Borneo, or whether you're in a quiet corner of Hay-on-Wye, 1 in 5 of the organisms around you is likely to be a beetle. Scientists have so far named, formally described, more than 400,000 different species. Beetles are the largest, the most diverse group of organisms on the planet. And there's just a snapshot of some of the beetles on this picture and in the drawers that I brought along with me. Now, 400,000 might sound like a lot, but this is probably just scratching the surface of what's actually out there in the tropical forests and the jungles and the deserts and the hills and the mountains of the world. And at the Natural History Museum, where I work, we manage a collection of about 260,000 species, about 22,000 drawers, going back to the voyages of Captain Cook and beyond. And this is one of the largest and the oldest collections of its kind anywhere in the world. And this collection was primarily assembled under one roof due to the vision of the great Victorian comparative anatomist, Sir Richard Owen. Now, many of you will know Owen. He was the person who coined the word dinosaur. He recognized that the big bones that they were digging up in the southeast of England were not some giant mammals or giant humans, but they were the remains of some gigantic reptiles. And Owen's vision was to have a cathedral to the natural world. He fought this through Parliament over decades and eventually had it passed by just a single vote that we could have a separate museum for natural history. Up until then, natural history had been in the basement of the British Museum at Bloomsbury, and with the age of exploration and the time of the British Empire, things were coming back from all over the world and there wasn't room for them. And Owen wanted to have this building. And when he was fighting it through Parliament, there was one politician who said, "But surely Professor Owen doesn't want to put every different kind of beetle on display. Such a thing would just fatigue and confuse the public." But some public were not confused and fatigued. Some public were inspired to a greater level of achievement than anybody could have expected them to have reached on a platform of dead beetles. My colleagues and I feel like we're standing at the center of a web of information. We have scientists from all over the world coming to us with inquiries about the collection, information that they need to gain from the specimens that we have in front of us. We've got collectors all over the world bringing back new species, describing new species every day of the year. And one of the things that makes the collection so important is what are called type specimens. And type specimens, which are indicated by a red label, are the original specimen of a new species that when a scientist names a species that has never been seen before, that has never been named before, the specimens that he or she has in front of them at the time when they make the description are called the type specimens. And forever afterwards, they become the vouchers for that species, that name. So if you want to know what I meant when I gave a new name to a species, 100 years after I'm dead, you come to a museum collection and you look at the type specimens, and that's how you can confirm. And a great entomologist who is better known for other things, and is probably better known here in this community, certainly for other things, was the Russian-American Vladimir Nabokov. And Nabokov is a little-known fact, curated the butterfly collections at Harvard Museum before he was writing. And he said at the height of his fame, after the publication of Lolita, that he would have traded everything that he had achieved for the life of a museum curator. And Nabokov is probably the only person to have written a poem in homage of type specimens. It has the concluding sentiment: dark paintings, thrones, and stones that pilgrims kiss, and poems that take 1,000 years to die, just ape the immortality of this red label on a little butterfly. The consummate artist acknowledges that immortality also lies in the delimitation and the description and the understanding of the biodiversity of the natural world. And 20% of the biodiversity of the natural world, more than the vertebrates and the plants combined, is the beetles. So a collection like the one at the Natural History Museum, a massive collection, is able to answer all kinds of questions about the natural world, all kinds of big questions, even the biggest questions about why we're here. I think it's no coincidence that the great evolutionists of the 19th century were both first and foremost enthusiasts, like Maya, like some of us in this room, about beetles. Charles Darwin famously neglected his studies at Edinburgh as a medic. He was then transplanted in disgrace to Cambridge to become a theologian. He was learning to be a county priest. He didn't do very well at that either. He spent all of his time off in the fields and the swamps collecting bugs. And his father said, "You care about nothing except shooting and dogs and rat catching, and you're going to be a disgrace to yourself and the whole of this family." That was the paternal summary of the man who appeared on our £10 note and has bits of Australia named after him. But Darwin persisted with his hobby, and he was picked up by an academic called Henslow and put forward to be a companion to the captain of the Beagle on a 5-year circumnavigation of the world. And Darwin was not employed as a naturalist, he wasn't employed at all, he was self-funded, and he set out on this trip, and when he got to the oceanic islands of the Canaries and Madeira and those islands, he started collecting beetles. And he noticed that the beetles that he was collecting were quite similar to the beetles that he used to collect back home in Cambridgeshire, in Shropshire, and places in the south of England. And he thought, that's interesting, these beetles are very similar to the familiar beetles, but a great number of them are unable to fly. So why can't they fly? And he thinks, well, these are very windswept islands, and possibly if these beetles were able to fly, they'd be blown out to sea. So it's in their advantage to be unable to fly. But he was reading Charles Lyell's book on the principles of geology at the time, and he knew that these islands were only a few million years old, and that it was too late, they were too recent for an independent creation of flightless beetles. So he thinks, maybe they were able to fly, and then they lost the ability to fly. Like when we select a pigeon to be white, or when we select a dog to be large, or to have a short snout, maybe there's some kind of artificial selection that we do with dogs and horses and pigeons. Maybe there's something in nature that's happening that's similar, and that one species can change into another, and that species are not fixed entities but can change. And all the way across the Atlantic, he's thinking, maybe species can change, maybe species can change. And he goes around the South American coast, and he gets to the natural laboratories of the Galapagos Islands, and he has this fantastic example of how species can change into one another. So this is prompted by the enthusiasm for beetles. And he comes back home and he writes his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. And at the time when Darwin was writing, another young naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, in the Spice Islands of the Moluccas in the Malay archipelago, was independently reaching the same conclusion. Maybe one species can change into another. And so out of the beetle collecting hobby of two young amateurs, and Alfred Russel Wallace was from this part of the world, he was from the Welsh borders. Some people claim him as a Welshman and other people claim him as an Englishman because the village where he was born has been on both sides of the border in the last 150 years. But Wallace and Darwin, out of their hobby, which some people thought was a fruitless waste of time of collecting and studying beetles, was born one of the biggest philosophical steps forwards in the history of human thought. I think that when you're looking at a group of organisms with 400,000 species, you see a picture of the natural world with a lot more pixels, a lot more resolution than if you're looking at anything else. And that's why having a collection like this is so important, to see the detail of the natural world. So my conclusion would be, if you have a hobby, if you have a passion, don't worry about critical politicians, don't worry about judgmental parental verdicts. Just persist with your hobby, and you never know. You might be able to add to a vast archive of biodiversity, like a natural history collection, and you might even come up with an idea that will change the world. Thank you.